I've made it rain at least 150 times. I've broken droughts in New Mexico and in Washington and in Malaysia. And normally, weather engineering operations, you're attempting to operate primarily on the chemical ether. Radionics is the field of understanding that any object is radiating into its environment information about itself that can be both detected and interacted with. This was one of the most important things that Newton discovered, was that he believed that when an object is at rest or when it is in motion, it's the same condition, and the only thing that's changed is the position of the observer. Einstein said was that gravitational mass was equivalent to, or the same as, inertial mass. In other words, the weight of an object is equivalent to its resistance to acceleration. And this is not true. Science is not meant to be a worldview. It is a formal method of inquiry. And this is part of the imbalance that this culture is steeped in right now.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Onnit, ONNIT.com. If you're trying to step up your fitness game, they have quite an extensive line of fitness equipment. They produce one of my absolute favorite pieces that I use regularly. It's called a steel club. If you're looking for a piece of equipment that you can have at home to gain a tremendous amount of benefit from, I highly recommend a steel club. Heavy clubs are particularly valuable for grip strength, shoulder workouts, rotational core workouts, barbell training. They can be used to enhance and improve your balance. They were originally developed in ancient Persia as a means for conditioning soldiers and wrestlers, and Onnit has essentially resurrected them for our modern man or woman to benefit from. So they're truly amazing, and they come from 5 pounds up to 45 pounds. And as for supplements, there's just tons of different supplements. If you're trying to enhance your sleep, look into a product they offer called New Mood. It's excellent. I used to go to the vitamin store and purchase a variety of individual supplements and combine them to make my own kind of sleep combination. But no need for all that nonsense. They've got the formula down to a science. I think it's valerian root, chamomile, jujube seed, a vitamin B3, B6, magnesium, L-tryptophan, and 5-HTP. And these, of course, are the highest quality, carefully sourced, earth-grown herbs and ingredients, and, of course, rigorously and independently tested for safety and efficacy. So, Onnit.com. Enter offer code Philosophical Minds at checkout for up to 10% off any and all supplements.
The future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
Welcome to the Philosophical Minds podcast, the podcast about the stuff we wonder about
and other things.
All right, we're here with Dr. Peter Lindemann. He's alternative energy pioneer, inventor, researcher, historian, and lecturer. How are you doing today, Peter?
Pretty well, Sky. Thanks for inviting me on your podcast.
Thank you for being here. So first off, to start, etheric rain engineering. You've done etheric rain operations, I believe, with Trevor Constable. This is actually possible. You know how to generate rain, so please tell me about these operations and tell people how this is possible.
Okay. Yes, it's not only possible, it's been done thousands of times. And with Trevor's passing in 2016, there's a shrinking number of people who know how to do it the way we've been doing it. But there There is a body of knowledge out there. It was originally discovered, these methods were originally discovered by Dr. Wilhelm Reich in the 1950s. And Trevor studied these early experiments by Wilhelm Reich and just kept developing methods that furthered the knowledge base, and eventually he morphed the material from Reich into some material that was developed in the Rudolf Steiner group, and eventually came to understand the operations of the atmospheric ether through the writings of a gentleman named Gunter Wachsmuth, who was a student of Steiner. And his Wachsmuth's book called Etheric Formative Forces in Cosmos, Earth, and Man lay out a very clear model of exactly how the various ethers are behaving on the planet, in our bodies, and in the greater cosmos. And from this model, it becomes possible to understand the flows of energy in the environment with which we engineer. So the equipment is made up of normal things, tubes and plastic and metals and different things like this that we just buy at the hardware store. The most important thing to understand is that the ether will pass right through any material. It's a very, very, very fine flow of energy in the environment, passes right through mountains and your equipment. So the question is, how do you get a handle on it? How is it possible to engineer this? And what you find is that in Wilhelm Reich's material, he found that in the method to build what he called an orgone accumulator that had alternating layers of organic and metallic materials in them, that it built up a structure that is not too different than an electrical capacitor, alternating layers of conductors and non-conductors. And when these materials are put in certain configurations, what you find is that there is either the ability to accumulate this energy to a higher level than the environment has, or to a lower quantity than the environment has in a localized space. And these are the things that are used to manipulate the larger flows of ether in the atmosphere. So it's a real technology. It's based on many decades of work in the field, trial and error, and eventually trial and success. And I've made it rain at least 150 times. I've broken droughts in New Mexico and in Washington and in Malaysia. So.
And is the orgone energy, is that synonymous with the primordial ether, or from what I understand, there's 4 different types of ether? Is that correct?
Well, in Steiner's model, there were four ethers, and Wilhelm Reich only saw that there was this energy he called the orgone energy, or the energy of the orgasm, which is named after. So he was just looking at it as a generalized life force field, life energy. So Steiner's model is more refined than this. It breaks these things down into what he referred to as the light ether, the warmth ether, the chemical, or what he calls the tone ether, and the last octave of it is the life ether. And normally, weather engineering operations, you're attempting to operate primarily on the chemical ether.
Okay. And so, are there other people out there currently doing this anywhere on the planet right now, to your knowledge?
This very day, yes.
And is that happening in the United States, to your knowledge?
Probably. Although no one in the United States that I know of was trained by us. I'm one of the only ones left here in the United States who was fully trained in this method.
Oh. And as far as the technology itself, is that a pretty expensive? Is it pretty expensive to construct some of this?
No, the equipment itself is not expensive to construct. What is expensive are the incidental logistical situations. In other words, if you're going to go, I live just outside of Spokane, Washington, but if somebody wanted to hire me to go to Australia and help them put out the bushfires, for instance, by making it rain on them, that there's huge costs in all the incidentals, putting me up, feeding me, driving me around, building equipment there once I get there, so we don't have to import anything. Lots of different things like that, so that the real costs of mounting an operation like this are incidental costs, but they're real costs.
Oh. And with this orgone energy, or the chemical ether, does this is kind of, I don't know if this is a related thing or not, but when you talk about Tesla's radiant energy, is that like a completely separate type of energy, or does that relate at all to this kind of energy?
Well, I would say that they're related. Right now, because the science that would establish exactly how they're related hasn't been done yet. So I tend to speak of these sorts of things within their own languaging. So Tesla referred to this energy in the environment he referred to as radiant energy, and he learned how to run electric motors and all sorts of other things, light bulbs with it, things like this. And it had a whole set of different behavioral characteristics, and it was freely available from the environment. Wilhelm Reich ran electric motors on orgone and different things like this. So there were a lot of similarities to these things, except they were conceived by their discoverers in different ways. Wilhelm Reich believed that the orgone energy was a mass-free energy, that it had no mass at all.
So there's the light ether as well, and something I think I heard you mention before with the light. So light is not actually transmitted in the visible spectrum in outer space. Is that correct?
There's a lot of controversy about that. Light itself is invisible. This is what most people can't really wrap their heads around. If you could see a light beam in the air, that's all you'd see, because it would block out everything, because you have light waves coming at you from every different direction. The light beams only convey information about what the light struck last when it enters your eye. So you don't, the space doesn't look like it's filled up with light beams. It looks like you're in a room and the wall is 3 feet away or whatever else. So the nature of light has been misunderstood in a drastic way, and it's the speed at which light conveys information appears to be instantaneous. This is what you're kind of getting at. Once the beam of light is established, the information it conveys seems to be able to travel along that beam instantaneously, not at the speed at which the beam was traveling to establish itself in this way. But after that, information travels along that beam instantaneously. That's the way it appears.
Wow. Now, you've done a lot of work with radionics. What exactly is radionics?
Okay, radionics is a word that came out of the 1940s and 50s. The word radio had just been invented in the 1930s to talk about what was before then was talked about as wireless communication systems. They talked about it as wireless. The word radio was owned by RCA, or the Radio Corporation of America. They invented that word. So that started people thinking about information being able to be conveyed across distances using electromagnetic waves in the air and so on. Many people had been using subtle methods of life force field detection, like water witching, rods and pendulums and things like this for a very long time. And in the 1700s and early 1800s, the whole methodology to produce homeopathic remedies, these remedies that start with a material, but you keep diluting it and diluting it and diluting it until there's nothing really there, except it still has this information field about what the material was in the first place. So with that as a background, what you can find, what you eventually see is that radionics is the field of understanding that any object is radiating into its environment information about itself that can be both detected and interacted with using specific equipment, which was referred to as the, quote, the radionic tuner or the radionics machine.
Wow.
And so most of the uses for radionics have been in the, we'll just call alternative, health field.
Okay. And if you don't mind, I want to bounce back real quick. In terms of weather modification, I've been online and kind of listening to some interviews and stuff, and there's something called stratospheric aerosol ejection, I believe.
Yeah, it's called spraying the atmosphere with, it's just generally referred to as, chemtrails or that kind of stuff.
Right, yeah. What's your take on that? From a health standpoint, do you know what the chemical makeup of that stuff is, or?
I haven't done a lot of direct study. I believe that there's information on the internet that is accurate and authoritative as to what these compounds are. Most of them are nano particulates of barium and other aluminum and things like this. They're obviously not designed to kill us, otherwise we'd all be dead already, because they started doing this in about 1995, and they are still doing it. So they've spent trillions and trillions of dollars putting these compounds into the upper atmosphere to make the upper layer of the atmosphere electrically conductive.
And is the intention of this, from what I understand, they want to block out the sun from coming through? Is that correct?
There's been some discussion as that they're trying to change what's called the ability of the atmosphere to absorb heat. There's a word that I can't pull from my memory right now, but that's one of the reasons they're talking about that it is being done. Personally, I don't believe that is the primary reason. I believe that the primary reason is to make the upper atmosphere conductive so that the method of weather engineering that they use can be projected to almost any location in the world. So the idea that these things are there to heal the ozone layer and to protect us from UV and things like that, I don't think that that's the reason it's there.
Right. Have you done any research or looked into the HARP antenna system? And
the HARP antenna system is what I'm talking about as far as the kinds of ways to project their methods of weather engineering.
okay.
But that system requires that the upper layer of the atmosphere have enhanced conductive qualities.
Okay. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about something called the Spectra system. I think this is related to color healing therapy. Can you speak to that at all? What exactly is the Spectra system, and how would somebody go about?
Well, Spectrachrome is a brand name that was developed by a very brilliant person who came to the United States from India. He was called the Edison of India. His name is Colonel Dinshaw Gadiali, and he developed a method of healing the body of almost anything using colored light, just shining colored light on the body, and various methods of doing that in different locations. So if you could, and so he developed a very simple method of making 5 color slides. His original ones were made of dyed glass, and then you could make different combinations of these different colors. These primary colors were violet, blue, green, yellow, and red. Those were the color filters that he used. And then by combining these 5 in certain ways, you could make 7 other colors, which included orange, which was made from the yellow and the red, a color called lemon, which is made from the green and the yellow, a color named turquoise, which was made from the blue and the green, a color named indigo, which was made from the violet and the blue. Then there was a color called magenta, which was made from the violet and the red, and a color named purple, which was made from the violet and the yellow filter. And the last one was called scarlet, which was made from the blue and the red filter. And but with these 12 colors, he could stimulate or sedate any body function.
And how is this so? What do you mean by he could sedate? Using these colors, he could sedate a specific body system. So each of these colors would pertain to a particular system of the body, and
correct. And so one color would cause that function to be stimulated, but another color would have that same function be sedated. So you could make things happen faster, or you could make things happen slower. And by being able to do that, you could enhance what the body was trying to do for itself. So I can give you a story about the use of colored light in an extreme burn situation, if you'd like me to.
please, yeah.
This was a story. This is an incident that happened in approximately 1976 or 1977 on the Big Island of Hawaii. I was living there at the time. A friend of mine who lived on a property just uphill from the town of Captain Cook on the west side of the Big Island. He was living on a coffee plantation, a leased property that had no electricity, where they were growing coffee. And that day, the truck that delivered the propane to the main tank on the property had just topped off the tank. It was about a 250-gallon propane tank. So this is a relatively large expense for the people on the property. And so that evening, he went from his cabin down to the tank with his little 5-gallon propane tank and started transferring gas from the large tank to the small tank. And what happened is he must have gotten a little bit distracted or something, because at the end of that process, he disconnected his small tank from the larger tank without turning the tank pressure off. And so when he disconnected the hose, the gas, the propane gas in the large tank started venting at full pressure. And he was looking at losing the entire cost of filling the tank, which was hundreds of dollars. And so he tried to turn the valve, but the pressure coming out of it was just too much. So he decided that if he put a wrench on it and hit it, tried to hit it with a hammer to get it to start moving, that would close the valve. But unfortunately, hitting the wrench with a hammer caused a spark, and it created a fireball that was about 50 feet in diameter. It burned him black from his waist up.
Wow.
The explosion was heard for 10 miles in all directions. This was an extremely severe burn. If he'd even been 3 feet further away from it, he would have been thrown 100 feet. But because he was right at the center of the explosion, he was just burned. Now, this was a serious injury. They took him to the hospital in Kona, which was about 15 miles away. And the doctors there at the emergency obviously admitted him and started giving him painkillers and antibiotics, because those are the first things. They usually just wait for the entire situation to settle down. They just try and manage the pain, but don't do anything about the burn until the pain settles down. Luckily, his friends had studied with a healer on Oahu named Stanley Burroughs, who had studied the spectrochrome system and taught it to some of his students. And Tony, my friend, was one of those people who knew about this. So his friends immediately set up a colored light system over the bed of Tony in the hospital. And they started treating him within 3 hours of the original burn. They also started applying fresh aloe and coconut oil to his skin to moisturize it again. But primarily they used colored light. And so, because obviously underneath all the char and everything, his skin was bright red, they shined blue light on it. And that is to intercept. Blue has the vibration of oxygen, and red has the vibration of hydrogen. So when these two meet, they create water, cooling, and they neutralize each other. So within 24 hours of these treatments, all the pain was gone. On the third day, all the char broke away, and brand new pink skin was forming all over his body. On day 10, he walked out of the hospital. He had ended up with one small scar on the inside of one arm, because that didn't get as much color as some of the other areas. and he handed back to the doctors all of their painkillers and all of their antibiotics, which he hadn't taken since the second day. And they did this right in front of the hospital staff, right there in the room. And of course, all of the hospital staff was just dismissing this as meaningless nonsense. And even though they saw it done, all the doctors could say is, and this is a direct quote, "Gee, you heal fast," which was the stupidest understatement that they possibly could have come up with. Normally, an injury of that type would mean horrid scarring over the entire, area, years and years of skin graft operations, and just on, and permanent disfigurement. Tony walked out of the hospital 10 days later. His hair was growing back. His skin had regenerated in all locations. And he has essentially no scars or anything else from the incident.
Wow. And is this something that, are people still practicing this?
Yes, but the world has gotten much more interested in doing things fast than doing things well.
Right.
So most people don't want to sit under a colored light, for an hour at a time, a couple times a day. It's too inconvenient.
And this device, is this a complicated device to assemble?
Oh, it's just horribly complicated, Sky. What you do is you make a little square box that's about 6 inches by 6 inches by 18 inches. You can make it out of junk you buy at the hardware store. You mount a light bulb at the back end, and you buy a number of different color filters from a theater supply company, and you shine the light from the light bulb onto the body.
So ridiculously simple.
Ridiculously simple.
Wow. And does it matter if you use glass filters or plastic filters, or is there any difference between all that?
Well, that's the trick, okay? Tom Brown and I spent 20 years working on developing a set of color filters that you could buy readily from the theater industry that would duplicate the exact color responses that Dinshaw had discovered.
Mm.
So yes, that was what took so long. But I know what filters will do that. And of course, if I tell you that I'm practicing medicine without a license, so
right,
it's all nonsense.
There's something that keeps reoccurring when I'm talking to various electrical engineers and people that are studying the ether, and it has to do with Einstein's theory of relativity, and what there's just kind of common consensus among these people that I'm talking to. And so what's the deal with this? You and many other people I've talked to say this, basically that Einstein's theory of relativity is kind of bogus. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, I wouldn't say bogus, okay? Einstein was a brilliant person, but he was primarily a mathematician and a theorist. His ideas of relativity were based on mathematical principles, obviously leading to this equation, E equals mc squared, which looks like a simple algebraic equation, but it has a number of very odd things about it. One, it's a third order calculus equation, and it has this very odd term called c squared. C is meant to represent the speed of light, which is also, we're told, the absolute top speed in the universe. So the idea of c squared is obviously an extreme abstraction, because it certainly isn't a velocity. Okay? So the most important thing you could come to understand is some work that was done by one of my early mentors, whose name was Bruce De Palma.
I've listened to him. He was fascinating.
Bruce De Palma ran a number of experiments in the 1960s where he dropped a rotating object next to an identical non-rotating object and found that the rotating object hit the ground sooner, harder, and with more force than the non-rotating object. And that seemed to mean, ultimately he discovered what it meant, and what it meant is that the property of inertia, which we were taught in grade school, that matter has a simple definition, that it matter takes up space and that it has inertia, okay, and that two objects can't occupy the same space because matter takes up that space, it fills that space, okay, and that inertia is the property of resistance to changing velocity, okay. In other words, when you want to take your automobile from 0 to 60, you need lots of horsepower. But to keep it going at 60 takes a lot less horsepower. Okay, and that idea, it has to do with overcoming the inertia or resetting the inertia to a different reference, i.e., the speed. So Newton's three laws, the one especially about inertia, basically means that inertia conserves 100% of the momentum of an object in reference to its original location. Okay, so what De Palma discovered was that inertia was not a property of mass. It's a property of space. And space confers its inertia onto the masses that occupy it. Now, this is a very unusual conception, but what it means is relativity says that inertial or gravitational mass is equivalent to inertial mass. Those are the ideas in special and general relativity, and what that means is that the gravitational mass is determined by taking an object and putting it on a scale. It's the reference is a stationary reference, but inertial mass is its resistance to changing velocity, and that's a dynamic reference. In other words, you have to have a movement that is different than the point of observation. If you're moving along with the object, it still looks stationary to the observer. This was one of the most important things that Newton discovered, was that he believed that when an object is at rest or when it is in motion, it's the same condition, and the only thing that's changed is the position of the observer. In other words, if I stay in the same reference as the object, it looks stationary to me. If I move, if I'm moving at 25,000 miles an hour around the perimeter of the planet as it rotates, and I'm standing right next to it, we're still moving at 25,000 miles an hour, but since we're both moving at the same velocity and the same trajectory, it looks stationary to me, but it's still movement. The fact is that the planet's moving around the sun at a speed, and then we're hurtling through space, in orbit around the galactic center, and all these things. And yet I can still pick up a glass of water here and drink it as if the glass is relatively stationary to my body. And the point is that what Einstein said was that gravitational mass was equivalent to or the same as inertial mass. In other words, the weight of an object is equivalent to its resistance to acceleration. And this is not true because inertia is a property of space. And De Palma's experiments demonstrated that if you take two identical objects, same shape, same weight, same material, you spin one of these things up to 20,000 RPM on a vertical axis, and the other one is sitting at the same level at the same time, and you drop them exactly simultaneously. The object that is dropping along its rotating axis will hit the ground sooner, harder, and with more force than the other one. And they're both being acted upon by the same gravitational force. That means that the inertia of one of them has changed because its response to the exact same accelerating force, i.e. gravity, is different.
Can you define gravity real quick?
Of course not. We have no idea what gravity is. We have no idea what inertia is. We have no idea what matter is. We have no idea what electricity is. We don't know. There is no definition of what these things are, only that we know what they do. We can flip a switch because there's and turn on a light in our room because somewhere else there's a large mechanical machine with copper wires that is rotating in front of a magnet. That's what's causing the light to light up over here. We know how to do it, but we don't know what that is. Tesla said in a lecture in 1893, the day we know what electricity is will be the greatest day in all of history. And when he died, he admitted he still didn't know what electricity was. And that's Tesla, the guy who gave us this stuff.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. And then now you developed something called the mechanical rotary transformer that you won a contest for, I believe. Can you explain what this was?
Yeah. The mechanical rotary transformer grew out of a contest that was offered by a gentleman named John Eklund, starting in about 1979. He was suggesting to the alternative community that there might be a way of building an electric generator that didn't slow down when you pulled electricity out of it. In other words, it didn't conform to what is generally referred to as Lenz's law. And Lenz was a brilliant German, actually Prussian physicist back in the 1800s, and he published a paper called on the reciprocity, the law of reciprocity or something like that, where he's openly showed that when an electric generator delivers current to a light bulb or something, the current moving through the generator activates a reverse motoring effect. In other words, a generator that's creating forward electric output will produce a reverse motoring effect, which makes it harder to turn at the same time that the current is lighting your light bulb. And he called this the law of reciprocity. And he believed that it was an example of the law of thermodynamics, which says that, for every, Newton's third law, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. They were all trying to prove out all of these things in as many of the sciences as they could back in the 1800s. And so Lenz describes these things. So what John Eklund was offering a prize for was, can anybody build an electric generator that produces electric power that doesn't necessarily make the prime mover have to pick up a larger physical load to turn it. Okay, in other words, somehow sidestep Lenz's law. And the mechanical rotary transformer was the first one that was brought to John's attention. I proposed the idea in 1981, eventually got a number of models and versions of it built in 1983 and 1984. We tested them at Borderlands Labs in 1986 and 7. Eric Dollard helped in a lot of the testing in that period. And we basically proved that it was operating at about 120% efficiency. But primarily what was interesting about it is that it had what we call a reverse torque profile. So a normal generator, most people know that if you don't plug anything into the generator, as far as taking an electrical load out, that's when it's the easiest to turn. The engine that's driving it doesn't have any real load on it. But then the minute you plug in a saw or a big electrical load, that's when the engine just has to start really working hard and everything, so that there's this direct relationship. You pull electricity out and the generator gets harder to turn, and that's a one-to-one operation.
Right.
The mechanical rotary transformer did the exact opposite. It got easier to turn the more electricity you pulled out of it. And it was the hardest to turn when you weren't taking anything out of it at all. And this was the first thing, this reverse torque profile, as I referred to it, was the first thing that proved to us that Lenz's law was not an absolute condition because we reversed the situation. In other words, it was a matter more of engineering and geometry that caused these relationships, and not some cosmic law that said they were going to show up no matter what you did, which was the generally prevailing idea at the time. Now we know how to build a wide variety of electric generators that don't get harder to turn when you pull electricity out of them. But the mechanical rotary transformer was not a practical design, but it was the first machine that I designed back in the 1980s that behaved in a way that proved that the laws of thermodynamics were not a limit for electrical equipment, and that Lenz's law certainly could be engineered around. So it's simply a device that acted as a teaching tool to us along the way.
So where did you go from there?
Well, I was in Santa Barbara at the time, and working off and on in the kind of the orbit of Bruce De Palma at the time. And he was always looking for big funding for his end machine projects. And I was watching how these things were going, and we were involved in very, very fundamental research at the time. Of course, we wanted funding. We formed a company, my brother, myself, and our machinist, Mike Knox, who was building these machines for us. We formed a company and tried to get some funding for furthering the work on these types of machines. And it was 1983, 1984 period was kind of a down period. It was a recessionary period in the United States. We couldn't get any funding, and eventually we all ran out of our own money to prop this thing up, looking for larger funding. And we all kind of just shrank away from the whole thing after, kind of going back and figuring out how we could all just go get a job and cover our own bills again. And that took up all the time. So I never again did try to start a business to raise money for basic research on these things.
Now, I heard you mention a few times, and this is a common figure in the alternative energy movement, Edwin Gray. Who was Edwin Gray, and what exactly was he known for?
Ed Gray was a promoter. When I first, Ed Gray's accomplishments or apparent accomplishments were what introduced me to free energy. At the time in 1973, in June, I ran into a number of articles in a little tabloid newspaper called the National Tattler. The editor was a guy named Tom Valentine, who was always tracking these types of advanced energy stories. And Ed Gray's story came out in early July, I believe, July and of 1973. And I managed to bump into a copy of this. I was traveling to see a friend from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I was traveling on a bus, a Greyhound bus, going to Ann Arbor, Michigan to visit some friends who were at the university there. And this bus stopped for a rest stop in Battle Creek, and we were allowed to get off the bus to go to the bathroom and buy a candy bar or whatever else that we wanted to at the rest stop. And there was this silly paper there, and I bought a copy of it. And because the headline was about, it said man creates engine that uses no fuel, will change the oil industry, by 1984. Of course, none of those things came to pass. But Ed Gray, it talked about this engine that he built that put out 80 horsepower, kept its batteries charged, and ran on this modified form of electricity they called cold electricity. And one of the demonstrations they talked about was that when you run like electric light bulbs, and that the only thing we had were either fluorescent bulbs or just filament bulbs. When you run these things, when you run a filament bulb on cold electricity, you can't be shocked by it. Now that was a pretty wild statement, but then they showed photographs of children playing with these light bulbs where they literally light the light bulb by the little power supply that's putting out this cold electricity, and they take the light bulb and they stick it in a bowl of water with their hand on it and don't get shocked.
Wow.
And the light bulb stays lit up, nothing, no sparks flying, no smoke, no nothing. The light bulb's happy to be underwater. The kids are happy to have their hand in the water. Nobody's being shocked, nothing's malfunctioning. The light bulb's on underwater. And I just said, oh my God. And that's what started me in this whole.
Does that have something to do with stripping the warmth ether out of the electricity?
Something like that. Yeah, it has something to do with, running things on light ether, stripping the warmth ether out. See, that's what Steiner said, that electricity, the way we use it, is an unnatural combination of warmth ether and light ether. That was his definition of it. And I've come to believe that that's very, very close. And that making a superconductor, everybody's thinking, well, we need to find a way of conducting electricity through, these things that have no resistance. But really what you need to do is strip the resistive characteristics out of the electricity so that it'll run on copper wires with no resistance. And that's what cold electricity is.
It's fascinating. Rudolf Steiner was on another level. It seems like
He was way ahead of everybody.
Indeed.
That's why he was, public enemy #1 in Germany.
And whatever.
Because he was really, really smart, way ahead of everybody, and he also happened to be Jewish.
Right. Perfect combination.
You can't have smart Jews around if you're going to try and claim that you're smarter.
Yeah.
It's very inconvenient. So yeah, Steiner is a very, very, very important to all of the things we're doing. He has contributed to so many of these things, including all the weather engineering stuff, and there's just thousands and thousands. And his whole conception of moral technology and moving civilization forward is not just about learning more, but becoming better humans.
His biodynamic farming work is great.
All of those things, yes.
So whatever ended up happening to Edwin Gray and all of the stuff he was working on?
That's a long story that is handled best by some of the products that I'm selling on my website, the real history of Ed Gray.
Let's talk about some of those products. What are some of those products that you're selling on your website?
Well, my website's products page is really the beginning of what we like to believe is a university courses in free energy technologies. There are a wide variety of there's about 80 products on the products pages now, and many of them are by brilliant people who have working technologies and are talking about them openly in public. The cost of these products is anywhere from $27 up to $47, or maybe some of them are a little bit more. Some of them have, are related to other products in package deals where you can get a discount if you buy them all together, things like this. But the products that I have generated for that group, probably the most important one is one called Open System Thermodynamics, where I talk about the work of, well, first of all, I go through the entire history of the development of man's understanding of what heat is and how it works, and the formal systems of what became known as thermodynamics in the 1800s, what we now refer to as closed system thermodynamics. But then in the 40s and 50s and 60s, a gentleman named Ilya Prigogine won a Nobel Prize for demonstrating the conditions that heat operates on in non-equilibrium systems far from the point of equalization, which is called open system thermodynamics. And these are the systems like a heat pump and other things like that where a small amount of one type of energy can be used to control a second form of energy in such a way that maybe that form of energy is available in the environment. And then you can move more of that heat. So, this is how your refrigerator works. A small amount of electricity is put into the compressor, and through a compression-decompression cycle, we can literally take heat out of the cold, insulated box and dump it into the into the kitchen from behind the refrigerator. There's always warm air coming out of the refrigerator. That's the heat that's being pumped out of the cold box. And these things have what's called a coefficient of performance of about 2.5 to 3 to 1. In other words, the amount of electricity going into powering the compressor, if we just turn that into heat in a resistor, that would represent only 1/3 as much heat as we're taking out of the box and kicking out into the kitchen. And that's the free energy that you can get by using these open system methodologies. And they call that instead of saying it's free energy or that it's a over unity machine, they use the term coefficient of performance, which is about 3 for a heat pump, which is like a refrigerator or freezer or air conditioner or any of those machines. And now they're putting heat pumps in clothes dryers and water heaters too, to lower the amount of electricity they use to do the exact same thing. And that's because they're plugging instead of generating the heat for these things, they are simply using the refrigeration cycle to move environmental heat into the water heater or the clothes dryer or so on. So it's much more efficient. It takes less electricity to get the same job done. So, yeah.
Is there anything out there that exists that's semi-affordable that you can run a house on?
You mean that uses these types of open system thermodynamic?
Sure. Any system that somebody could read a book on or assemble that within that they can make themselves that could handle the power of a home?
No.
Okay.
No. And let's look at this from an objective point of view. Let's say there was plans to do this, okay? Mm-hmm. In other words, let's look at this realistically. If I ask you, if I go to the Office Depot and I buy a pencil, and I hand you this pencil, it's got an eraser, it's got the graphite in the wood stick, it's painted, it's got all that stuff, okay? And I say, duplicate this for me in a shop. Do you think you could do it? The answer is no. You have no idea how to make a pencil. Okay, so the point is, I'm not being cruel because I can't make one either. Okay, the point is that people are way outside their element when they start thinking about, I'm just going to build myself a 5 kilowatt electric generator that runs itself, and I don't know anything about. I couldn't make a pencil to draw the thing.
That's a good point. So
people don't have the skill base to make these things. Okay, they don't understand the physics that the machine is supposed to operate on. They don't know anything about it, okay? So even if I gave you complete blueprints on how your lawnmower works, just your lawnmower, okay, you couldn't make one.
Right.
That's the problem. The problem is that this society has stopped doing things for themselves and gotten very, very used to the convenience of being able to go to a store and just buy one. And therefore, the population is absolutely dumber and less capable of meeting their own real needs than our great-grandparents, who had to do everything for themselves.
Right. So what would be the optimum strategy for somebody who wants to try to optimize their home in a way that they're saving the most money? And even if there is some investment involved, what would you recommend?
Well, we've made all these recommendations. There's a product on my website called Home Energy Savings Guide. Mm-hmm. Okay. We went right through the whole house and said, here's where your house is wasting energy. We came to the conclusion that most people buying energy for their home, 70% of that energy gets wasted before it gets used. And so the whole idea is right on the cover, we guarantee that if you use even half of the recommendations that your utility bills will drop by 50%. And I actually had a guy call me after we had the book out for a couple of years. He called me up and he said, I wanted to let you know that when your book came out and I saw the ads for it, I just thought you guys were idiots. And then I kept bumping into it, and something was nibbling away at the back of my mind, and I started thinking about it, and I thought, well, maybe these guys might be onto something. And so then I bought the book. Then I read through what you were saying, and I saw that it was just idiotically practical and completely, science-based and everything else. And I started making these modifications to my home. And as I did it, I found even a few more things that you didn't write about in your book. And I actually got to the point where I lowered my utility bills 70% from what they had originally been, and I was living exactly the same. I had all of the heat and comfort that I had before I was paying 70% more.
Wow.
And I just wanted to call you and tell you thank you so much for writing the book.
That's amazing.
Okay, so that actually happened. So the point is that when we put on the book that we guarantee that you can save 50%, we knew that that was a minimum.
Now, is there any potential with using something like a grounding rod of some sort? Is there any kind of generator that can be made using the telluric currents of the Earth?
Probably, but I don't know the science for that. I don't know what that device might have to look like. And I don't know what kind of power would come up, and whether it would be compatible for running your light bulbs and your computer and stuff.
Oh, true.
These are the things, is that the appliances that we have are designed to run on this, what Steiner referred to as this unnatural combination of warmth ether and light ether. It's a very specific form of energy. And if you feed it a different form of energy, it's not going to do the same thing. If I force 120 volt AC energy into my computer, it's going to blow up because it's designed to run on low voltage DC. Same thing, If I take a flashlight that runs great on a few batteries, and I plug it into the wall, the thing just blows up. You can't give it the form of energy that, So we're not. Most people haven't thought about these things at all, about exactly how restricted each one of these little appliances is as far as what form of energy it takes to run it.
Yeah. I heard you mention something about the production of free hydrogen via something called super electrolysis. What are some of the applications of that technology?
Well, applications. The most impressive thing I've ever seen is a guy who had developed a two-stage turbine that created some sort of, I don't know exactly what the process was, but he could take room temperature water, run it into this turbine, turn the turbine with an electric motor, and what came out was water and a bunch of gases. Most of the most prevalent gas was H1, single hydrogen atoms, but there was also some H2 and some other gases with it. And because the gases and the water coming out of it were of a higher volume than what was going into it, the outer edge of this turbine was designed to take advantage of that pressure rise in the system to create a torque that reinforced the turning of the motor. In other words, relieved it of its load. So the faster you turned this thing, the more hydrogen it would make, the more pressure it would build up, and the more the turbine started acting like an engine, until you got to a critical speed, after which the machine would start turning the electric motor as if it was a generator, and it would take room temperature water and create, a continuous stream of hydrogen and other gases being cracked out of the water, and more and an increasing amount of pressure in the system that made the turbine self-rotate.
Wow.
So that's free hydrogen.
Yeah, I've heard it.
That's just free hydrogen. You can call it anything you want. And I've seen those things. I've seen that machine run. That's an absolute truth. That's a fact. It's there. The guy is brilliant. He's putting millions into it.
It's amazing. I've got some relatives that have some property up in the woods, and they know somebody that has a hydrogen generator. I don't know how it works, but the guy's supposedly built it all on his own and everything, but kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's an awful lot of technologies out there that are, not where the business model around these things still favors secrecy.
right.
And therefore they're not known. But you can't do something that's undoable. If nature allows it, then there it is. It doesn't matter what the humans say the laws are. If nature supports it, there it is.
Now, what kind of potential do you think exists in terms of electric engines, and what have you seen that's actually operational? Not talking about like a Prius, because I'm pretty sure that's a dumbed down version of what's possible. But
No, Prius is just an electric motor run on a battery, backed up by a gas engine running a generator. There's nothing extraordinary about that at all. No, nothing is going to happen in the electric transportation industry until you start running what we call self-running electric motors. In other words, an electric motor that only borrows the electricity it's running on and gives it back to you after it's produced its mechanical energy. And of course, this is supposed to break all the laws, blah, 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 but it's all nonsense because these things exist. And so the problem is that when you put a motor like this in an automobile, then you can drive as far as you want. If you put this in an airplane, then you can fly over every border or under every radar or anything else. And all of a sudden, ordinary people become uncontrollable from a governmental point of view. And then we end up with the problem like we have here in the United States on the southern border, where the border is open. But these types of things open every border. And you see most countries actually like to keep their borders controlled.
yes,
Whereas here, we've turned it into a political football and, obscured the reality that everybody else, is intelligent for maintaining their borders, except the United States should have an open southern border too, and that somehow this is just all, it's being anti-Mexican or something else, it's all such insanity. I don't understand any of it.
I agree.
But, if the Democrats want the border open, why don't they just pass legislation saying anybody can come across that border and be done with it? But of course, then people would see through the whole thing, and then of course then it would never happen. So the point is that not supporting the laws is the simplest way of creating chaos, and still looking smart.
Multiwave oscillator. What exactly was the multiwave oscillator?
Okay. Multiple wave oscillator was an outgrowth of a great deal of work by a gentleman named George Lakovsky, who was a Russian engineer who moved to France in the 1920s. And he started working with doctors in Germany and Italy and a number of other places, because there were towns in those areas that were showing up with cluster cancer cases, and he was brought in as a consultant to try and figure out why this was happening. And what he found out was really startling, that basically he found that there was an energy coming up out of the ground that was making these people sick. And that was, as he studied this more, he found out that there was a very, very, very high frequency energy coming in from outer space. It would penetrate down into the rock formations below ground level, and then was transmuted to longer frequencies that were still extremely short waves. And then they would be re-emitted up out of the ground. And that these frequencies were right on the order of the wavelengths of our physical cells in our body, and the DNA strands and the mitochondria and things like that. I mean, just incredibly short waves, but they were still much longer waves than the cosmic energy coming in from outer space. And so when this process happened over certain types of geological formations, the frequencies were shifted into other octaves, and they didn't support the metabolic processes as well. He published a number of books. One of the most important one is called The Earth and Ourselves, where he talks about this discovery that these energies coming up out of the ground is actually what animates our cells, and he was 100% convinced that this is why we're alive in the first place, that the DNA and all of our metabolic processes actually evolved in this environment and was designed to operate at the cellular level on these energies. So then he came to the conclusion that the people who were getting sick in these towns were sitting on a geological formation that was slowly killing them. And so it was obvious that the remedy for this was just to tell everybody to move the town. Of course, he knew that was going to be a non-starter. And because their families had been living there for years. So generations, actually, especially in that part of Europe. So he decided to develop a machine that he called, his first generation of machines was called a radiocellular oscillator, and it was designed to produce what he referred to as a constant compensating field. In other words, if he could produce a machine that would produce this spread of frequencies, then maybe the disease responses would go away, and they could continue to live in this energy environment as long as they were supplemented with the right energy field. And he was able to cure a lot of cancers from these towns with this first type of device, the radiocellular oscillator. But after he was finished testing it and everything, he decided that what he really needed was higher frequencies, more frequencies, and and a little bit more power also. And so his second machine, which used a completely different type of circuitry and methodology, was what he called the multiple wave oscillator, that basically produced every single frequency from about DC up to about 20 gigahertz. Every frequency simultaneously, so that any cell or structure in your body could find its own resonant frequency and be energized directly, mechanically, by the emission. And even if the cell was damaged and its natural oscillatory rate was shifted, that frequency was also in the spread, so it could pick up energy, even in its slightly damaged form. It could gain energy, it could heal itself, it could shift back to its regular frequency, and that frequency was still in the spread and everything. So by giving the body every frequency that was possible, the body could find energy to basically heal itself of everything. So it wasn't designed to heal any particular disease. The multiple wave oscillator is specifically designed to provide the body with this constant compensating field, which allows it to take from the field absolutely every frequency or resonant vibration that any cell or any tissue or any organ or any mitochondria, or any DNA strand could need to make its structure whole again.
Now, in your time in Hawaii, I think you did some training with a guy named Clifford Lee. Who is Clifford Lee, and what did you learn from him?
Clifford Lee. Clifford was a Korean gentleman. He grew up on Oahu and had moved to the Big Island just about the same time I had moved to the Big Island in 1973. He had studied a lot of martial arts and some of the more esoteric Qigong practices, the ability to move energy with your mind, accumulate Qi in the body and so on. He was a very, very advanced adept. And the lady that I was living with at the time when I moved to Hilo in March of 1974, had asked Clifford to do some healing work on me. And so Clifford started coming over once a week in the evenings, and I would make him tea, and we would sit in chairs across the living room from each other. And these sessions were unlike anything I had ever experienced before or after. We would sit around, we would drink tea, we would laugh and make jokes about a wide variety of things. And then he would just say, the energy is starting.
Oh.
And we would both be taken to this altered state and be there for a while. And then we would kind of come out and look at each other and crack a few more jokes and drink some more tea. And then this would repeat. And so there were a couple of sessions that looked like that. And I didn't really know what was happening. Probably about the fourth session, he was scanning my body with his hand. And he came upon an area in my lower abdomen where I had a hernia operation when I was in high school. And they had cut all the nerves and everything. The doctors were pretty, unsubtle in those days. And he just says, "Oh, you don't have any." He was just scanning it with his hand, and he says, "Oh, you don't have any feeling in there, do you?" So, that was the first indication that, oh, this guy has perceptual abilities that, go beyond, normal people.
Wow.
And then I was about to start telling him about the operation and how they cut all the nerves and everything. And before I could get a full sentence out about the story of how that happened, he simply said, "There, how's that?" and all the feeling came back on. He just reconnected all the nerves, boom, and he didn't touch me.
Whoa.
And I was just shocked. Obviously, I had no idea such things were even possible. Another, probably the next session he was scanning my body and touching various locations, which I assumed were acupuncture points. And at one point he hit a point on my leg, and all of a sudden the entire meridian just lit up like a string of Christmas tree lights. I could see all the points. I could see the energy running in my body. I could see where it was going out the point on my toe and all this kind of stuff. And it was just like, it was some sort of initiation. I don't know whether he was trying to initiate me, but some switch just got thrown in my head, and all of a sudden I could see all this stuff.
Wow.
And we ended up doing, I think, 10 or 11 sessions. I was paying this guy $50 an hour, which in 1974 was a lot of money. Yeah. And but I came away from it with the ability to look at you across the room and open your chakras. I mean, I ended up with capabilities I didn't even know existed before, and I could do them just with a thought. So I started studying acupuncture and all these different other kinds of energy healing methodologies just to find out what I could already do. I could do it. I just didn't know what I could do. I didn't know what there was to do. So the first year was very, very disorienting. And I learned that most people, when they found out how much I could know about them or how much I could do, their first response was just being absolutely afraid of me, because people like to believe that they live in their own little world and where their lies are safe and no one can see them. And that's just not the way things are. On the inner planes, everything is visible. And so I learned how to turn off most of these abilities for my own sanity and for just so that I could have normal relations with people. I don't look into people unless they ask me to, but I can still do this type of energy work. You know, even like right now, I could work on your energy right where you are.
Wow. So like, is this what's referred to as shiatsu balancing? Or is that something?
No, shiatsu is a very specific methodology where two points on the body are used, and usually they're both touched at the same time by a practitioner in the room. Shiatsu is a Japanese energy balancing methodology. Yeah, it has nothing to do with this. This goes back to this sort of methodology goes back to very, very ancient and secret methodologies developed in China, you know, more than 1,000 years ago. And there's never been any books written on these things.
And like you were saying, you felt like this was kind of some kind of initiation process. So is this something that people can develop on their own, or do you think that this is something that has to be kind of transferred? Or
I don't know. Clifford did not try to transfer this stuff to me.
It just kind of happened.
It just happened. It was just some sort of karmic event that we get together. He try and do his energy work on me, and I just get activated by it. Neither of us really understood why my system responded the way it did. I still don't know why, other than it's just one of the things that happened to me when I was 24.
Wow. And is he from a specific culture or family that this is inherent in?
Not that I know of. Clifford died in 2001.
Wow.
So he's no longer here, but he was absolutely, one of the, what I would call, a healer of last resort. He could, in another situation, a friend of mine who had had a very, very bad acid trip and really screwed up his nervous system with fear and anxiety, did one session with Clifford, and when Clifford understood what the guy wanted, he had him right back in the middle of his psychedelic freak out within 15 seconds, and he just pieced his psyche all back together and brought him out sane again. And that whole process took about 5 minutes.
Wow.
And after that, it was over for him.
That's fascinating.
So, I mean, there are people who do this. I've met them in other situations. I am one, I don't have the capabilities that Clifford had.
This is kind of an underground thing that people just kind of keep to themselves for the most part.
Well, when you see how people respond to what the idea that you can know anything about them, most people think they have things to hide, and most people don't want to believe that there are people who can see right through them.
Right.
Because they don't want to see into themselves. They haven't done the work on themselves. They aren't 100% honest with themselves. And therefore they think they need to hide that. And why would you want to hang around somebody who you can't hide anything from?
Yeah.
It's a very odd, situation. I'm speaking to you openly about it because you asked. But normally I wouldn't bring this topic up.
I appreciate it. Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a couple questions before we wrap this up. Who are some of your greatest influences or teachers, and what are some of the most mind-blowing or valuable things that you've learned from them?
Oh, you're bad. Well, certainly, I would say Bruce De Palma taught me how to think. That was very instrumental. He taught me how to think about science. He taught me how to ask important questions. So that was remarkable. Clifford Lee obviously had a gigantic influence in my life, has opened me up to levels of reality that I never dreamed existed or had thought about philosophically, but actually didn't have any real idea how they operated until Clifford somehow threw a few switches in my brain. So those two were very, very instrumental, in my younger years. I would say the most important set of teachings I've ever run into is the Urantia book. It's a 2,100 page book I've been studying since 1971.
Tell me about that.
It doesn't work well with in a soundbite situation, but the book claims to be the fifth epical revelation of truth to the planet by the real spiritual forces running the universe.
It's called the Urantia book.
Yes, it's Urantia, and from what the book says, that is the name of this planet in the universe records.
Oh.
So it's like saying it's the Earth book. Okay.
Is this Edgar Casey?
It is not. It is not a channeled work.
Oh, okay.
It is a work of direct transmission from higher intelligences down into physical form. There's a whole book on how the Urantia book came into existence. It's complicated and doesn't lend itself to a soundbite situation.
I'm intrigued. Well,
it's the most profound book I've ever read, and I continue to read it. It's had the most influence on how I understand my place in the world. I would say the last person who has been a gigantic influence in my life is my current spiritual master, a lady named Jo Dunning.
Is that Jode?
J-O.
J-O, okay.
J-O Dunning. She is, I believe, one of the most enlightened beings on the planet. And her energy work that I've received over the last 11 years, 12 years, has absolutely altered my life.
Wow.
And really picked up where I got left off with Clifford, but pieced me back together in a way that was so gentle and such high integrity that I am just in such deep appreciation and admiration for her work. I really find it very difficult to find words to talk about it. But I would not be able to do the things I can do today without her work on me and with me and in me.
Well, is there any last words you want to leave the audience with, and any direction you want to point them to in terms of your work, or?
No, I mean, I would say that my life has been very abnormal.
I'd say so.
And in many ways, I've lived my life kind of backwards with the extreme initiations when I was in my 20s, and spending decades trying to figure out what it all meant. Rather than starting, with not knowing things and gently learning things up until I was really smart and talented and skillful. I kind of, I did everything backwards. And I have believed things that everyone told me was untrue, and I have proved them wrong over the decades. But this has been my life. This was the experience I was meant to have. And I don't think anyone should aspire to try and do any of these things, because I was just on the same path as anyone else of just trying to be true to myself with what was going on with me and the experiences that I was having. I was trying to understand them and, not maladapt to them, but to adapt to them in a true and correct way. And so, don't look at my story as weird, unbelievable, or anything else. It's just another human story. It just happens to be profoundly different than most people. But unfortunately, I've turned out relatively sane. I'm hilariously funny when given the opportunity. So, and I don't take myself seriously. None of these things have made me more important than anyone else. None of these things have, but that was a struggle, to have all of these extraordinary things happening to me and still maintain a sense of equilibrium. This has been the real work.
Right.
This is what I am so grateful for Joe Dunning for.
Well, you seem like a very balanced person overall. I mean, you got a very logical, analytical side as well as a spiritual side, and I think that's kind of the key.
Yeah, it's the harmonizing of all of these things, which is what we're really being asked to do here. I think science is wonderful, but it doesn't, it doesn't describe everything that's important in a life. You can't weigh, how much your mother's love weighs, or there's no inertial, acceleration formula for, the taste of an apple pie. So science has its uses. Science is not meant to be a worldview. It is a formal method of inquiry. And, this is part of the imbalance that this culture is steeped in right now. And this is part of why, a science that is unwilling to be moral is destroying the planet because it can. And this type of behavior must be discredited in every possible way before we will be able to stop creating the mess and clean it up quickly with technologies that are already here.
Yeah. Well, Peter, this was a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it, and hopefully maybe we can do another one sometime.
Okay, Sky, put it up and see whether people think you're nuts or not.